Priceless ancient treasures torn out of the ground. Precious art ripped from walls and sold to the highest bidder.
22, 24, 26.
Welcome to a multi-billion-dollar black market nobody wants to talk about. Until now. The grandest of mankind's achievements reduced to obscene commodities. The spoils snatched up by wealthy collectors from shady middlemen, laundered through a network of international criminals. It's a global crime wave, where the cash ends up in the pockets of the world's worst crooks, while nobody asks the big questions. How can it still be happening? This is a modern tragedy. History itself dug up, destroyed, or sold off. To understand the scale of looting historical artifacts, look no further than modern Syria. Sophisticated and cynical religious invaders literally dig pieces from the ground and sell them to black market dealers in Western countries to buy weapons and fight a war against the same countries. Absurd? Quite possibly.
The trade's main target buyers are, ironically, history enthusiasts and art aficionados in the United States and Europe, representatives of the societies which ISIS has pledged to destroy.
But when zealotry combines with political instability and a lack of international courage, the very history of the world becomes a commodity.
People need to realize that they're taking part in international crime. If they stop buying, then they stop the market. There will be no need for the market. It will become unfashionable.
Welcome to loot in Syria, a multi-billion-dollar murderous mess. And it isn't finished yet. Syria, an ancient land blessed with stunning archaeological wealth.
So Syria has always been this important area, both for settlement and for trade, and then obviously also for invasion. So I think that's why archaeologically it's a very rich area.
Home to a dazzling past, it is a proud country. The perfect setting for any ambitious, fanatical religious group to gain a foothold.
The big moment came during the start of the war in Syria in 2011, when very early on, cultural heritage became a casualty of the war itself.
For Syria, 2011 was to be a fateful year, and a catastrophe for its priceless cultural heritage. ISIS. This savage terrorist organization goes by many names. Islamic State, ISIS, Daesh, ISIL. It is a stomping ground for madmen, misfits, and murderers. Their plan is to drag the world back into the Dark Ages and establish an Islamic caliphate within a politically vulnerable Syria. But behind their brutality, Islamic State fights a very modern war. Their weapon of choice is social media. But how does an organization like ISIS help fund itself? By using the proceeds of looted ancient treasures.
How much ISIS earns from looting ancient artifacts is difficult to assess. The group clearly encourages and facilitates the trade.
And the biggest irony is that the riches pouring into their pockets will come from the same people they're hell-bent on slaughtering, whilst those trying to stem the tide will face scenes of appalling horror and immeasurable loss. It all started during what became known as the Arab Spring.
The Arab Spring started in Tunisia, with people in Tunisia taking the streets because they were upset about the political and economic situation.
December 2010. A fruit seller in Tunisia sets himself alight in a desperate protest against the country's brutal autocratic regime. His suicide sparked violent protests across the country.
There's extraordinary anger here mixing with the smell of tear gas. Either this is the first Arab revolution of the 21st century, or it will be brutally suppressed.
It felt like change was in the air. Long repressed people across the Middle East and North Africa followed Tunisia's lead. Inspired by what they saw happening elsewhere, Syrians took to the streets. A bloody military crackdown led to tens of thousands of civilian deaths, millions displaced, and a prolonged civil war. A festering wound had been opened within Syrian society, ready for radical Islamists to infect. And Syria's peerless ancient past would bear the brunt of it all. The men and women in the streets recorded everything and broadcasted it to the world. It was a social media revolution. Protesters communicated and organized online, and there was precious little the government could do to shut them down. It changed the way the world reported and consumed its news. You didn't need a camera crew to become a frontline reporter. All you needed was a mobile phone. It was a shot across the bows for traditional media. To compete with bloggers and YouTubers, they would have to supply better content. And that would play straight into Islamic State's hands. Social media would become a formidable weapon in their armory. It would be used not just to recruit, but also to loot. It wasn't the first time social upheaval, war and invasion had offered opportunities for rampant looting.
The removal of art and cultural heritage kind of furthers this destructive advance that comes from conflict and control. So the Romans, for example, there's plenty of evidence, even in Roman art, of Romans sacking and pillaging the areas they conquer and bringing home symbolic spoils. This has been a feature of conflict for millennia. It seems to be something that people do to subjugate others, is to take their cultural and heritage.
In modern times, the practice continues, as Syrian government soldiers gladly take bribes to studiously ignore the frenzied plundering of ancient sites. Rebels swap loot for weapons in Lebanon, and Free Syrian Army brigades take a cut of the antiquities trade in the areas they control.
There was a pre-existing looting culture, if you like. There was a culture of illicit trade and looting already established in Syria. There were dealers already in place. There were routes in place. There were smugglers in place. In a way, what Daesh did, I think they came in and they took control of what in the past had been an illegal network, and they effectively legalized it.
Essentially, when they first started to take over cities and territories in Syria, they came upon a pre-existing situation with regards to looting of antiquities. That was already ongoing. They didn't start that.
But Islamic State would take the art of looting to a whole new level. If they were going to get the nation of their dreams, the treasure chest hidden beneath Syria's ancient soil would deliver the money they needed to fund it.
The taking of these materials and the supporting of these networks of looting result in the killing of human beings. And this became very clear with ISIS. They turned this into a trade through which they could support the purchasing of weapons, the enslaving of people, and the killing of others.
A decade earlier, the insurgency that ripped Iraq apart after the 2003 US invasion had much to teach Islamic State. It was a lesson in looting that would serve them well in years to come. The ground beneath their feet was a treasure trove,
The illicit trade in antiquities and other cultural objects really began to be perceived as a problem, I think, for the international community generally. The objects being taken, they were large, historically important or artistically important objects, and they'd be going into major museums in North America or Europe. So the actions that followed and policy that followed tended to focus on large art treasures. So whereas back in the 60s, it wasn't really worth anybody's while to go digging out small antiquities in a site somewhere and then transport them onto the market. Now it is profitable because they can be sold on the internet, they can be sold over social media.
But Islamic State learned something else in Iraq. Large and well-known antiquities were expensive to move and difficult to sell. But smaller artifacts, dug fresh out of the ground, that would be different.
So in a way, I think the mindset behind public policy is still thinking in terms of treasures, they're thinking in terms of big auction houses, they're thinking in terms of big museums, and they're not really focused on the fact that a lot of the trade now is in small objects which won't be sold at major auction houses, they won't enter major museums, they're going to enter small collections, but they're still generating money, they're still generating large amounts of money which can be used by groups such as Daesh and other armed groups, to further their violence.
In 2013, ISIS made its move in Syria by inserting itself into the ongoing civil war. While its fight against the Assad regime developed, ISIS would cleverly fund its war with the profits from smaller artifacts that were easily moved and marketed. Syria's archaeological landscape is one of a kind. Antiquity is part of the texture of everyday life. It's one of the things that makes Syrian antiquities so special. But it also makes it vulnerable. With more than 15,000 archaeological sites in Syria, it's an embarrassment of riches. And when those objects are stolen, the knowledge they represent is lost forever. In Syria, every spadeful of dirt can turn up a bucket load of ancient objects like these. They're hardly in short supply, so does it really matter if some are shipped off out of the country? Should collectors feel guilty about where they've come from and from whom?
There is an argument that's made in some areas of the art world and the dealing of antiquities and the collecting of antiquities that these activities save these objects from destruction, usually in areas of conflict.
People say, but we are saving these objects. We're keeping them here in the safe haven of the West.
One of the first problems with this argument is that it very conveniently gives people an excuse to do exactly what they want to do. It very conveniently gives people an excuse to break the law.
Cultural heritage and antiquities obviously belong in their own context. The idea that you can somehow separate a cultural artifact just seems fundamentally wrong.
But unfortunately, if these items move into the private market, there's no guarantee they're going to be protected either.
There's never any shortage of people willing to turn a blind eye. So as the fighting reached fever pitch across Syria, looters were primed and ready to go. Islamic State's plan for world domination began with its own nation-state. For the people forced to live under its rule, it would be a living hell. In June 2014, Islamic State got its wish. They announced a caliphate in Syria and northern Iraq. Eventually, they would control an area the size of Austria and impose brutal rule on almost 8 million victims, but they didn't stop there. The aim was to take their twisted ideology to the world, and social media was their outlet of choice. ISIS took its murderous campaign to the world. Over 2,000 people were murdered outside Iraq and Syria in more than 140 terrorist attacks. Most people recoil from the horror, but for some, it's a rallying cry. By 2015, Islamic State signed up 80,000 fighters. With an army of that size, the threat to Syrian heritage loomed large. Dr. Ammar al-Azm is one of Syria's most accomplished archaeologists. And as ISIS swarmed over the Syrian landscape, taking control of city after city, he was deeply worried. He would eventually go on to help the international fight against looting. But at this point, his focus was on protecting one of Syria's most precious museums.
If it happened in Iraq, it could also happen here. And I'm sitting in a museum, and I'm looking at my museum, and I'm thinking, wow, all right, this is what happened in Iraq, and we could be next. We decided that we needed to put a plan in place, a contingency plan, both in terms of how we would quickly respond and adapt, and also how we might be able to recover these items if they ever got looted. And then I got called up by someone from the security services, said, what are you doing? And I said, well, you know, we're trying to put this contingency plan. You saw what happened in Iraq, and I was really excited, and I was explaining. And the guy just listened to me and listened, and he said, okay, you will cease and desist immediately. You are instigating unhealthy thoughts. This is defeatist talk, as if something like that could possibly happen in Syria.
But the museum was doomed. Amir, sensing the inevitable, managed to escape to Lebanon. Exiled from Syria, what could he do to help save the country's unique heritage?
In terms of how we started to get material, one of the things, my initial concern, and that's going back as early as 2012, 2013, was really out of a response to pleas for help from friends and colleagues inside Syria. They were calling us, what can we do? How can we save these items? How do we protect our museums? How do we protect our sites? So my initial involvement was mainly with that. As we started to sort of connect with each other, and essentially we established this network of cultural heritage, if you will, activists, archaeologists, museum curators, etc., within Syria, and mainly in areas back then outside regime control. And remember, by 2015, 2016, the Syrian regime controlled less than 30% of the country. The scale of the looting was catastrophic, and you could see it on satellite images, you could see it with photographs that people were going out and documenting the destruction, the looting, and they were sending it to us, and in turn we were using this information, I was using that information to try and draw attention, raise awareness about what was going on, the damage that was happening to Syria's history and culture.
In ISIS-occupied territory, the ancient Assyrian city of Nimrud had stood for almost 3,500 years. It was also blessed with some of the world's most iconic ancient works of art.
What ISIS did with the selling of antiquities was obviously very cynical, because on the one side that they were saying all of this is religious and it should be destroyed, and on the other hand they were, was the basis of their economy.
In April 2015, Islamic State intensified their propaganda machine.
The UN says this cultural cleansing constitutes a war crime.
But those of us who were watching from a distance were also completely devastated by what was happening. At the time, I was working on writing my textbook, and it was particularly difficult because as I was writing the chapter on Nimrud, it was exactly the same time that Nimrud was exploded. And it took all the strength I had just to move on, to write the next line, to just continue to write this book so that there would be some record of it going forward, so that future generations of students could learn about this.
When ISIS had finished, over 70% of the ancient city was destroyed, and they broadcasted every blow online. UNESCO condemned it as an atrocity. but that wouldn't bring it back. It was a big win for Islamic State propaganda, and the Western media played straight into their hands. The world's reaction told them that they'd hit the mark. For Syrian archaeologists, it was a grim foreshadowing of things to come. The jewel in the Syrian archaeological crown was the ancient city of Palmyra, on the hub of trade routes that joined the Roman Empire with Persia, India, and China. It was one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. And ISIS had it firmly in its sights.
Well, Palmyra is this amazing city in the desert. It's obviously very famous. It's listed as one of UNESCO's World Heritage Sites.
Palmyra is one of the most amazing sites. It was a multicultural world where people practiced many religions and spoke many languages in antiquity, and one of the most beautiful places in Syria.
One man has devoted his life to this most precious of places. Khaled al-Assad.
Well, the best way to describe Khaled al-Assad, I think, in the most simple terms, is he was Mr. Palmyra and had been involved in the archaeology and restoration of the main site from its earliest days as a young man, and then became the head of its Antiquities department.
The ancient ruins are surrounded by the modern city of Palmyra, which is where Khaled had lived and worked for over 50 years. In 2015, Khaled's world literally came crashing down.
When ISIS invaded the city, many people, including, his sons and his family, fled the city, and in the process also tried to save some of the most valuable items or objects from the museum.
With Islamic State fighters nearing the outskirts, Khaled al-Assad packed up his family and sent them running with as many priceless artifacts as they could carry. But Khaled stayed behind. Palmyra was in his blood, and he was not going to abandon it. May 2015. The city of Palmyra fell, and right outside its gates was one of the most perfectly preserved ancient sites on the planet. ISIS had a clear plan. Anything that couldn't be moved would be destroyed. Everything else would be sold.
Evidence that ISIS has sanctioned the looting and sale of antiquities to generate revenue for terrorism is a game changer.
I saw things online, for instance, from Palmyra being sold, which was kind of ironic considering literally at the same time Palmyra was being overrun by ISIS. So you had these kinds of things happening all at the same time, and no one seemed to be paying attention to that.
But if the world wasn't paying attention before, ISIS would make sure it was paying attention now. With a vast area now under its control, Islamic State was raking in funds from the usual sources: oil sales, taxes, and property. But being terrorists, they also did things sovereign nations wouldn't. And with at least 4,500 cultural sites under its control, Syria's ancient past was just another resource to be exploited.
So these guys were obviously making a lot of money because they were investing in the machinery, in the fuel that you need to run the machinery, in the crews that are doing the digging and extracting this material. And they were going literally, site after site after site.
Gathering up the loot wasn't left to chance. Documents seized in a US Special Forces raid revealed an organizational flowchart better suited to an accountancy firm than a terrorist group hell-bent on mayhem. And leading the raids was Abu Sayyaf. After climbing the Islamic State hierarchy, Sayyaf was handed control of the Diwan al-Rikaz, literally meaning the department of precious things that come out of the ground, which means oil and antiquities.
ISIS sees cultural heritage as a resource to be exploited like any other. And we know this because ISIS has a dedicated department for the administration of the looting of antiquities. You can see here, for example, this is one of their offices in the city of Manbij.
In the beginning, Abu Sayyaf and his band of jihadists weren't planning on getting their hands dirty. They sold licenses to those who wanted to do the digging. All they asked in return was a 20% cut.
When ISIS was issuing these looting licenses and requiring in return that you pay a 20% tax on your profit. But then we see an evolution in that, from initially simply issuing out licenses to people and allowing them to continue to loot, to getting more organized in terms of getting involved in the sale itself. So we see this gradual evolution from initially just issuing licenses, that's the institutionalization process of looting, to ultimately an industrialization of the process, an intensification, where now you're bringing in bulldozers, you're bringing in entire crews, you're involved in this looting, trafficking and sale of antiquities at every single level of the process. And if you don't think that this is producing good material, here are some of the finds that came out of this one licensed site that was being looted. Not only these pieces of pottery, but also these items all coming from a Bronze Age tomb complex.
By 2014, almost 2.5 million Syrian refugees had fled into Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, even Iraq. And for those left behind, desperation was growing. The country was in freefall, and Abu Sayyaf didn't have any trouble finding volunteers. For some Syrians, it was a matter of survival.
In a conflict zone like Syria, are these mostly, or in many cases, subsistence looters trying to just find something they can then somehow sell to make a little bit of money.
Because the preservation of history wouldn't feed their families.
People have lost their livelihoods, they've lost their fields, they've lost their crops, they've lost their jobs at factories or schools or whatever, then they start digging around and looting.
Before long, Syria's landscape was pockmarked and scarred. It was looting on an industrial scale.
When you bring in machinery, when you hire people to do the labor, you're essentially investing money. And you're not going to put money into something unless you're getting a profit, a return on it.
Starving Syrians were reduced to looting their country's past for one reason. Wealthy foreigners have a taste for Syrian antiquities. But how exactly did ISIS get their loot to market? Once again, the terrorists surprised the world with their social media prowess.
We noticed this new phenomenon emerging, and that was the fact that these looted items were now starting to show up as images that were being sent on social media platforms like WhatsApp.
Amir soon realized there was something very significant about all these social media posts.
Between late 2014, early 2015, you have this explosion of people on Facebook essentially trafficking in looted antiquities. The initial process started off as gathering as many images from would-be middlemen, dealers, etc., who were in possession of these photos and then basically collecting them and archiving them. Because I very quickly understood that this is the only time we're ever going to see this stuff. That's the only record we have of this item, this cultural heritage item that had never been seen since it was buried in the ground.
For Islamic State, it was a win-win. They sold whatever they could behind the scenes and destroyed the things they couldn't to win points in the propaganda war. In 2014, the US Congress was told that the sale of antiquities was Islamic State's second biggest money spinner behind oil sales. It would even get to the point where social media sites were publishing the equivalent of looting for dummies guides.
Videos are uploaded, sometimes showing people how they're looting and instruction manuals effectively on what looting that's happening. I even saw a video of a guy doing this kind of funny looking dance as he's looting a site with a metal detector. So all kinds of things you can see pretty much online. And you know, Facebook certainly is not helping, let's just say.
Abu Sayyaf, now curator of Islamic State's own antiquities department, took advantage of looting at classical sites. He knew that Greek and Roman ruins meant finding conveniently small and potentially high-value items like coins and jewelry. It was a smart move. The Mediterranean is full of Greco-Roman sites with small Roman artifacts that could come from anywhere. And identifying them as loot is tricky. It's also easy and cheap to smuggle a coin or ring across a border. Most buyers of these artifacts have no idea they're handling stolen objects, and they certainly wouldn't know their money was funding Islamic State's horrifying mission.
The trade's main target buyers are, ironically, history enthusiasts and art aficionados in the United States and Europe, representatives of the societies which ISIS has pledged to destroy.
But could ignorance of these artifacts' dubious origins continue to be used as an excuse?
So I think if people begin to associate that kind of conflict with antiquities themselves, then hopefully there'd be a bit of a conscience in people that would prevent them from being bought in the first place.
As world authorities clamped down on the illegal trade, Islamic State responded by using encrypted messaging services such as WhatsApp.
So if you look at the content of these Facebook groups, you'll find someone will post an object or an item for sale. There's often coded language for how they do it, and as soon as somebody gets interested, after 2 or 3 posts, you'll see, let's talk privately.
I hate to sort of jump on and everyone's beating up Facebook bandwagon, but certainly it's true. They are certainly perpetuating, and I'm sure if we look at these leaked documents that have come out recently, we would find something about the antiquities being another area which Facebook has not clamped down on.
It was a way around the inconvenient fact that glorious ancient objects don't just appear out of thin air. If it's an important piece, it will have been studied, exhibited, and written about.
Historians, archaeologists, those who study the past, provenance is probably among the most important things to have. It provides context where something is from.
Even the most amoral auction house staffer or dealer won't put up a major piece for sale without a backstory or some sort of history.
Within the study of cases of trafficking of antiquities, we've been able to document a lot of false provenances, a lot of false backstories, a lot of fake stories that have been developed by these Janus figures and other intermediaries to mask the illicit origins of antiquities and to make a plausible story of legality for collectors and other buyers to buy into, to conveniently to believe, so to speak.
With looted objects, documentation can and often is fabricated by the dealers and middlemen who take the loot to market.
They're not necessarily completely believable, but they're just enough for a buyer to suspend their disbelief or to cover their own potential culpability when it comes to buying loot. You also see attempts to move antiquities through multiple different transit ports, so multiple different cities and locations, so that it can gain paperwork as it moves through these transit ports.
2015, and thanks to a US Special Forces raid, Abu Sayyaf's methods were revealed. The 7 terabytes of material they found is the largest intelligence haul in special operations history. Amongst the data was a catalogue featuring thousands of small but incredibly valuable objects. By focusing on these small Greek and Roman objects, Abu Sayyaf and his team were able to evade the law, which tends to target big-ticket items. By August 2015, half of Palmyra had been razed, and Khaled al-Assad's life's work shockingly vandalized as seen on news reports from around the globe. Khaled, who remained in the city until the end, must have known what was coming.
ISIS, being what they are, eventually decided to arrest him and executed him.
Days after Khaled's murder, militants rolled barrels of explosives into the 2,000-year-old temple of Baal Shamin. If Nimrud was the rehearsal, Palmyra would be the main event. Its greatest monuments were razed to the ground, and its epic amphitheater was used to stage bloody mass executions. As the news hit the headlines across the globe, the world reacted in horror. In 2015, ISIS continued its murderous attacks around the world. In a case of twisted irony, ISIS was using the millions plundered from the illicit trade with the West to fund attacks on it. On the 13th of November, a coordinated series of bombings and mass shootings in multiple locations across Paris killed 130 people. Law agencies across the world demanded answers. How were these elaborate attacks being financed? Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda were kept afloat by obscenely wealthy donors. But Islamic State was different. It had a large, well-resourced territory to pillage. Amir al-Azim and his fellow academics were on the case as they tried to work out how much money Islamic State might be getting through its looting activities. By looking at the 4,000-year-old city, Tel Biyah, US academics estimated how much Syria's ancient past might be worth in monetary terms. About 10% of the Bronze Age site was excavated by archaeologists before the Civil War. They calculated that the antiquities they found would be worth about $4 million on the open market. That's one tiny proportion of one modest archaeological site in a country with 15,000 or so others. Multiply that across Syria and Iraq, that's a vast sum of money. Amir and his colleagues lobbied the UN and other international bodies in a desperate bid to put a stop to the cultural carnage.
As part of this whole push against ISIS, the UN Security Council, it basically banned the sale and trafficking of any antiquities coming out of Iraq and Syria.
While this may have been a good start, world governments needed to be aware that it was the smaller artifacts that were slipping through the net.
So I think policymakers have a problem, and they have difficulty coming to terms with the idea that what they really need to be focused on aren't major art treasures. It's kind of, if you like, the bric-a-brac of antiquity.
On the 16th of May 2015, a pre-dawn military raid was carried out. Leader of the ISIS antiquities market, Abu Sayyaf, was shot and killed. Left in his wake was a treasure trove of information about his operations, and clues for chasing down the artifacts Islamic State had sent out of Syria.
I think it was very good that suddenly there was some documentary evidence of the value of the trade to Daesh.
Amir al-Azum and his colleagues were also using technology to chase down the people buying and selling Syria's cultural heritage online.
I created this tool to look at sites like eBay, for instance, where we use machine learning, natural language processing to effectively inform what kind of objects are being sold online to better track the trade of antiquities. So at least we can get a sense of where illegal sales are happening. At least we can try to stop them.
But they had an uphill battle. The law was only looking for high-profile prosecutions, and the media was only interested in big headlines. Many of the things stolen from Syria didn't fit the bill.
And then, of course, this type of material is a lot easier to transport. And it seems to me, you know, I mean, material's just smuggled out any way you want. As I said before, it can be in a rucksack on somebody's back. It can be hidden in a car. It can, you know, it can be sent by mail.
In 2020, Facebook responded to accusations that it was operating as a marketplace for the trade in looted antiquities by banning the sale of all historical artifacts on its site.
So we found groups that were posting material that we knew was clearly looted and trafficked looted material. And we contacted Facebook and said, hey, look, this is a problem. And we did this several times, and every time it would come back, no, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't contravene our community standard. So clearly, this is not something they're interested in doing. It was just a publicity stunt, low-hanging fruit.
With Facebook not coming to the party, and world authorities struggling to legislate and prosecute effectively, new conflicts throughout the region offered looters new opportunities.
Conflict destabilizes the fabric of society that tends to protect cultural heritage. On the one hand, as competent authorities disappear, security goes away. The ability to monitor sites and prevent looting is gone.
As for the best way to protect what's left, the people on the front line in the battle to protect cultural heritage share a dream.
I think we enjoy culture, we study culture, we interact with culture. But buying culture, I think, needs to become an unethical crime. We need to start with the end user, which is the West. People need to realize that they're taking part in international crime. If they stop buying, then they stop the market. There will be no need for the market. It will become unfashionable.
Meanwhile, in Syria, the war goes on. 500,000 people have lost their lives. And in 2018, it was estimated that over a quarter of the population had fled the country. Islamic State, which lost its caliphate, is still a force. The United Nations has said that over 10,000 militants remain active in Syria and Iraq. The human cost of the civil war is overwhelming, and the loss of cultural heritage is dire. For many Syrians, their identity is bound to their past. At all costs, their past must be preserved for the sake of their future.